It was the kind of place you'd imagine for a weekend retreat, quiet, secluded, and surrounded by trees that looked like they had stood for centuries. Maple Ridge was a small town, just a couple of hours outside the city, nestled in the heart of a dense forest. Most people in the area preferred to stay indoors during the winter months, when the town was covered in a heavy layer of snow. But for a few adventurous souls, it was the perfect setting for a weekend getaway. When Emily and her boyfriend, Ryan, decided to head out to Maple Ridge for a weekend trip, they were looking for peace and quiet, a break from the constant noise of their busy lives. Ryan had found a little cabin through a rental site, and although it was a bit more remote than they anticipated, they were both excited. The place was charming at first, quaint with rustic wooden floors and a stone fireplace that promised warmth during the cold nights. But as soon as they arrived, something about it didn't feel right. The cabin was isolated, so isolated that it didn't even have a neighbor for miles. The air felt thick, like it was suffocating under a blanket of silence. Emily noticed it immediately, but she didn't want to let on to Ryan, who was too busy marveling at the beauty of the woods. They unpacked, got settled in, and had a quiet dinner before turning in for the night. First night wasn't terrible. There was the occasional creak of the old house settling, but that was to be expected. However, around 3 a.m., Emily woke up to the sound of something else, something unfamiliar. It was a soft tapping noise, rhythmic, almost like someone was knocking at the door. She lay still, her heart pounding. She looked over at Ryan, but he was fast asleep, unaware. She got out of bed quietly, trying not to disturb him, and crept toward the door. The whole place felt off, and the thought of opening the door made her skin crawl. But curiosity got the better of her, and she slowly reached for the handle. When she opened it, there was nothing there. No one. Just the cold, dark night stretching out before her. The tapping had stopped the instant she opened the door. Emily stepped outside, her breath coming out in clouds of white vapor, the ground covered in a fresh layer of snow. She looked around, but there was nothing, just the stillness of the wood. Maybe it's just an animal, she whispered to herself, though it didn't sound convincing. She closed the door behind her and went back to bed, trying to shake the unease that had settled in her chest. Ryan didn't wake up once, completely oblivious to her distress. The following day, the weather turned even colder. A thick fog rolled in, blanketing the cabin and the surrounding woods in an eerie haze. Emily felt a strange pressure in the air, like the earth itself was holding its breath. They decided to go for a hike to clear their minds, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle in the trees, every crack of a branch sent her heart racing. Ryan, on the other hand, seemed completely oblivious to the strange energy surrounding them. The hike took them deeper into the woods, and before long, they were completely disoriented. The dense fog made it difficult to see, and the familiar path they had been following seemed to disappear into thin air. Panic began to set in. Emily looked around, but all she could see was white mist and looming trees. "Hurry in," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to get back," but Ryan wasn't listening. He was busy inspecting the surroundings as though he wasn't concerned at all. "Don't worry, we'll be fine," he said dismissively. "We're just a little lost, that's all." They walked for what felt like hours, and just when Emily was starting to get desperate, they stumbled upon a small, abandoned cabin. It was nothing like the one they were staying in. It was old, decaying, with broken windows and a sagging roof. The door was ajar, as if inviting them in. "Let's check it out," Ryan suggested, already heading toward the door. Emily hesitated. The air around the cabin felt oppressive, as though something was wrong with it. But Ryan was already inside, and she reluctantly followed. Inside, the air was damp and the place smelled musty. There was nothing remarkable about the cabin, except for one thing. In the corner, there was an old wooden chair facing the wall. It was the kind of chair you'd see in a horror movie, a creaking with age. But what made it even more unsettling was that it was covered in what looked like old, dried blood. Emily gasped, stepping back. "Ryan, we need to leave. Now." But Ryan wasn't listening. He was staring at something on the floor, his expression blank. She approached him, heart hammering in her chest, and saw what had caught his attention. There on the floor was a journal, tattered, its pages yellowed with age. She reached for it, but when she touched it, a cold wave of dread swept over her. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The writing was faded, but one word was clear: help. Before she could read more, a loud crash came from the other room, like something heavy falling to the ground. Emily's blood ran cold. She turned to Ryan, but he was no longer beside her. He was standing by the window, staring out into the fog, his expression vacant. "Ryan?" she whispered, but he didn't respond. Terrified, she reached out to him. But before she could touch his shoulder, she felt a cold, skeletal hand grasp hers. It wasn't Ryan. She spun around, her scream caught in her throat, but all she could see was the pale, twisted face of someone looking at her from the corner. It was the last thing she saw before everything went black. When she woke up, she was back at the cabin, alone. The fog had lifted, and the eerie silence had returned. Ryan was gone. The only thing left was his phone, lying on the floor, cracked and covered in dirt. The authorities never found Ryan, and the town of Maple Ridge quickly became a place people avoided. The cabin where they stayed was abandoned, left to rot in the woods. But some say that on quiet, foggy nights you can still hear the tapping sound from the cabin and see two figures walking through the mist. One of them staring out into the distance and the other, a shadow, still waiting to be found.